Well, hi everybody, meteorologist Joe Chaffee. Welcome to the Joe Chaffee Weather Show on this 13th of August, 2019. I think on a day that we can call it the day of the big severe weather fizzle, because that's really what it was. I went to bed last night. Of course, we saw what SPC did yesterday, and we talked about how this whole severe weather event was going to evolve. But there were a couple of caveats, and and one of them, a very important one, was the fact that, well, where was the warm sector going to set up? That has really been key to all these severe weather events. And of course, most of them, when it came down to it, the warm sector set up pretty far to the north and set up the severe weather of whatever particular event you want to point back to in the last 6 or 7 weeks. So you figured, well, okay, shouldn't be any different this time around. Well, a few things wound up being quite different. And I guess the first thing was, and this is not to blame SPC for anything. I mean, they know this stuff a lot better than I do. I think Joe Rayo has always described it pretty well. We kind of act like general practitioners, and SPC, they're the specialists when it comes to severe weather. Like the Hurricane Center, they're the specialists when it comes to hurricane forecasts. So, we know a little about a lot of things, and those guys know a lot about one specific subject matter. So you figure they saw it bullish, so you got to kind of go along with it. But again, always remember with these severe weather events, you got to follow the radar, you got to follow the satellite, and you got to follow the observations. And it was pretty clear this morning that it just wasn't going to be the case. So I want to pull up the 1 o'clock surface map, and I wrote about this on my website today. So if you want to read more, you certainly can go to meteorologistjoechaffee.com or check it out on the app. It was the late afternoon post that I did. But this was the mesoscale analysis. It might be a little hard to see. I'll try to make it a bit bigger here. This was the mesoscale analysis from SPC. And this is where the warm sector wound up setting up. And among other things, the surface low that moved eastward was actually quite weak and quite flat. So the warm sector actually wound up setting. I drew the warm front in, and it was a guess on my part, because when you look at the observations, we'll show you those in a second, the warm front, the warm sector doesn't really stand out all that well. So your severe weather risk winds up shifting further to the south. Now, remember, we had models and the idea that this low was going to probably track more along the New York State-Pennsylvania border and push the warm sector maybe right along Route 84. And that would have meant that temperatures in New Jersey and Long Island today would have climbed up well up into the 80s, and we would have been going crazy with thunderstorms. In reality, we had many areas today that didn't get out of the 70s. Some places didn't even get out of the low 70s. And the spots that did make it out above 80, they didn't get there until late in the afternoon. So you need to have, in the severe weather events that we've dealt with, there were a couple of them where we actually had a fairly well-defined surface low that moved across northern Pennsylvania or moved across upstate New York. There was a rather strong warm front, a well-defined warm sector. In one or two of those instances, that warm sector pushed all the way up into northern New England. And in this case, you really had to go from the southernmost New Jersey counties, Atlantic and Cape May, and maybe even just Cape May, southward down through Delmarva and into Virginia, in order to really get into the warm sector. Now here's the look on the latest surface map. And this is going to bear out what I've just been saying. You've just got this weak low. Look where this is WPC. They have a stationary boundary drawn right along the Pennsylvania-Maryland line. Now, clearly, if you look at some of these numbers, you're seeing temperature dew points upper 80s, dew points in the low 70s. Where you've got temperatures in the 70s, it's because they've had a thunderstorm go by. But up to the north, and I'll move the map over a bit. You can see the numbers here are all, you're looking at temperatures mid to upper 70s, temperatures across New England and Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, a lot of spots only in the low 70s, and dew points that they were up there, upper 60s, but if you don't get the daytime heating to play, it isn't going to work. And the frontal boundary itself is still up to the north in upstate New York, running southwestward to the PA state line and then up through northern Ohio, and then it kind of swings across back through northern Ohio, northern Indiana. You start to get into some really nice dew points as you go further north. You see these dew points up in Michigan down in the 40s, 50s and 40s, 40 dew points up into Canada. So there is a push of dry air here. The problem is that that push is just not enough. You don't have the shortwave trough that we're dealing with here is probably among the weaker shortwaves that we've seen come along in this northern jet. There wasn't really a fairly well-defined shortwave trough, and the NAM was a big fail because the NAM did actually have a small but amplified shortwave trough. Instead, as we went through the overnight models, and from this morning when I got up and looked at everything, it basically split that shortwave in two, where you have one hanging down from Maryland on southward, and of course that's where you see the surface low, and you got your thunderstorms that developed there, and even there they weren't crazy. There were some severe storms, but I've certainly seen far worse outbreaks. And then your second shortwave to the north with the frontal boundary just kind of hanging there and just waiting to move along to get that through. So as it turned out, the severe weather setup that yesterday, and I didn't even know this, by the way, I heard about this this morning, that because I as a rule I don't really pay a whole lot of attention to what other people are saying, but apparently this was played up to be some big widespread tornado event. And you got to be careful with these sorts of things, because you got thrown a curveball this time around in terms of what it wound up happening. And in hindsight, should have caught this. I should have saw this yesterday. I want to go back and look again and see what it was that I missed. I guess I overplayed the NAM a bit, but I found that the hyperbole that did come out yesterday by some, even if it was as bullish as it was, there's a way of explaining a situation where it looks like it's going to be a widespread outbreak without going off the deep end. It's not like we haven't had severe weather outbreaks this year. If we were absent from outbreaks, you could say, all right, this really kind of looks like it could be a nutty day. But we've had some really serious outbreaks, so you could at least have measured it along the lines of saying, well, it may be on par with the others that we've had, and you still would have been obviously you would have been way off the mark, because the outcome for a lot of areas was that not much happened. Now take a look at the current map from the Weather Service. You can get this map by going to the Mount Holly National Weather Service website. It's on their homepage. You can punch it up and set it up any way you like. And when you look at the rain that's showing up on the radar offshore with a couple of heavier cells, it really does look like an overrunning rain area that extends from the Atlantic westward across parts of New Jersey. A lot of this, by the way, is overdone. I find that on this, these lighter blues that you see, actually the precip is not reaching the ground in those areas. I would focus on the green, and particularly in the yellows. And you still have some patchy rain back in parts of southern Pennsylvania. But look at the temperatures. I mean, they're all in the low and mid 70s. You've got an odd 81 here at Caldwell, but that's probably because the sun came out. But everybody else sitting in the 70s. Coastal temperatures as of 7 o'clock on Long Island are in the low 70s. In southern Connecticut, they were in the low 70s. Even down when you get into southern New Jersey and on up into parts of northern Maryland, you're seeing temperatures mostly in the middle to upper 70s. Southern PA, the same thing, range low to mid 70s there. You have to go really down into Virginia and the Delmarva Peninsula, where you start to see temperatures in the upper 80s with dew points in the mid to upper 70s. Now, bear in mind, there have been thunderstorms that have rolled through here, so you're seeing temperatures in the 70s in parts of southeastern Virginia. But again, that's because they've had thunderstorms go by and knock the temperatures down. Earlier, a couple of hours ago, you'd have pulled up these numbers and you would have seen a few places even up into the lower and middle 90s. So it was there's where your warm sector was. And even when you look at, if you look at the wind profile here, it's your low center is, you've got northeast winds west of Pittsburgh. The station here, Wheeling in northern West Virginia, has got a northwest wind, but very light, 5 miles an hour or less, 5 to 10 miles an hour. There's a very weak circulation that is in that area. That's where your surface low is, and it's very weak. You look at the wind field, you would expect to see southwest winds where you are in the warm sector, but the winds are so light. Yeah, you do have some southwesterly winds in a few places, but you also have a few spots reporting a southeast wind, generally under 5 miles an hour. There really was no, you didn't have at least a not that you needed a wrapped up surface low, but you needed something with a little intensity as far as a surface feature there to really get that warm sector established solidly, and where there was a really stark difference with the air that was up to the north. And you know, that dry air that we had over the weekend that lasted into a good chunk of yesterday before the dew point started coming up in the evening, that held on. The old trough just kind of held on a bit longer, probably helped to suppress this system and keep it weaker as it moved along to the east. Now, here's what wound up happening as far as the risk area was concerned by SPC. This was issued late this afternoon, but the one before this was not very different in terms of where the risk area was outlined for today. This kind of looks like the map I woke up to this morning. Slight risk, southern Virginia, North Carolina, back through Tennessee, and marginal risk, maybe for an isolated severe thunderstorm in the rest of West Virginia down to just north of the PA-Maryland border and into southern New Jersey. I think that marginal risk line may actually be a little bit too far to the north. And of course, we also have slight and enhanced risk setting up in the plains in western Kansas, eastern part of Colorado, on up into western Nebraska. That's the other active area, and a small area of marginal risk tonight up in parts of Minnesota and western Wisconsin. And over the next couple of days, by the way, we're probably going to see the severe weather risk calm down a bit. Leftover marginal risk along the Virginia, North Carolina coast southward into southern Georgia, southern Alabama, back over into Louisiana. And of course, you still have that slight risk up in eastern Colorado, northwest Kansas, western Nebraska. And then when we moved on to day 3, which is Thursday into Friday, you're just kind of left with a marginal risk there in the plains and not much else left in the eastern part of the U.S. We're going to go into a pattern, I think, going in for the rest of the week and into the weekend, where not really much is going to happen. You're going to be pinned with a stalled frontal boundary on one end. You're going to have higher pressures to the north, and the next cold front really isn't due until probably Monday night of next week. So until then, we're just going to kind of struggle along and deal with the frontal boundary offshore. Clouds will get thrown back northwestward. I don't really think we're going to see much in the way of showers or storms. Maybe there'll be a few of the odd pop-ups from day to day. Some days yes, some days no. And that'll carry us right through Sunday. The next 3 days, by the way, for much of my area, northeast PA or eastern PA into southern New England, but particularly the northern part of that range, we're probably going to see temperatures that are going to have a tough time getting above the 80-degree mark. Areas to the south will get a bit higher, Humidity levels are going to be stubbornly high, but there's not going to be a whole lot for the atmosphere to work on. Look at the radar tonight in the east. I mean, you could just—it's like a big yawn, really. You've got that rain area that's across southern Pennsylvania, just kind of right on the edge of where that warm sector is. You have a broken line of thunderstorms in southeastern Virginia, in the interior of North Carolina. It looks like right now they're crossing I-95 and moving over to the other side to go east of I-95, and those storms extend further south but become much more scattered through South Carolina and Georgia. You got a pretty decent line of storms moving across central Tennessee at the moment. Florida, the southern half, has been generating some downpours and a few thunderstorms the last couple of days. No different today. There's some diurnal stuff as you go further to the north. We've seen coverage a lot worse than that. In Louisiana, southeast Louisiana, seeing some rather strong storms going on this evening there. And as we go to that other risk area, also starting to see some pretty hefty storms here that have developed in northwest Kansas, southwestern Nebraska, moving southeastward, and some scattered heavy storms in southeastern Colorado, right, moving along into the Oklahoma Panhandle. So that pretty much covers it as far as what's on the radar. And of course, folks, as always, it is coming up on 7:20 Eastern Time. So remember, what do? We always make sure we go to the most recent radar and check your local National Weather Service office just for any watches and warnings that might be up for your area. And you can get that by going to weather.gov. Okay, on we go to where this pattern is headed. And I think we've been getting this. We've been dealing with this jet stream. We've been talking about the fact that the southern end of the jet drops southward, then it lifts northward, then it buckles and comes southward again. Going into this week, you'll notice that you've got, I'm just going to run this backwards a little bit and start with Sunday. So there's your trough off the East Coast. You can see that the trough in New England overnight and this morning really didn't pull out. There's actually a secondary push of energy that came down into southeastern Canada and over into New Brunswick. That probably forced this next weather system to be not nearly as robust. It's much harder to pick out a short wave here in the east for tonight. The troughing just kind of hangs back. You got some weak short waves that try to move along in the flow, but they really don't amount to much. And over the next couple of days, you just see that the jet kind of pulls up a little bit up into New England. You have an upper high that's near Bermuda that's not that it's building strongly, but it's building enough. So it's keeping that frontal boundary along the East Coast. It's actually keeping that frontal boundary right along the immediate coast or just inland of the coast. And that is problematic with regards to some showers and storms that might be around in the southeast. But it also, we've been talking about, we were talking about a few days ago that maybe we could you might wind up getting some kind of a wave to develop off the southeast coast, and that maybe you could have this become something tropical. But if you're going to pin a frontal boundary right along the immediate coast, it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to pull that off. Going through the weekend, the jet stream actually pulls up a bit, so I think we're going to see some warming. There's a shortwave trough with a cold front for early next week, but notice that it lifts up north of the Great Lakes towards James Bay. You don't have it digging down, so the impact here, I think, from this next front for Monday is not going to be anything too serious to worry about, but maybe a little bit of shower and thunderstorm activity when the front goes by, but I don't see it with the absence of a deep shortwave trough in the flow. I think it's going to be hard to pull off any kind of widespread severe weather. And going through next week on the new GFS, that jet kind of stays very close. You see a strong shortwave that is swinging into southeastern Canada. This is the latter part of next week. If it's real, the jet stream tries to pull slightly southward because the trough is actually too far to the east. And yes, by the way, on this run, we do have a tropical system that the GFS develops We know all too well that we don't take that seriously until we get inside the 5-day time frame. And given the fact that we're still haven't seen much of anything going on this month, it's probably a wise thing to do. And also, by the way, it's on this run in particular. It's there on some runs, gone on others, so we don't pay attention to that. And then that trough pulls out. So it looks like the jet is kind of pulling a bit more to the north over the next 10 days to 2 weeks. And eventually you do have a ridge across across most of the southern half of the United States in the latter part of the forecast period. It's not building it strongly. You still have that westerly flow across the northern tier, just kind of hanging there. So I think that really just that idea is something that's relatively consistent with what we've had. So I don't really see any huge changes. It'll be a matter of whether the model is missing out on a stronger trough coming down and digging down and bringing that jet further south. So we'll see how it evolves. But I think it just kind of looks sort of like we could call it Dog Day-ish, August Dog Day-ish for the next week or so, or maybe even a little bit longer than that. So taking you through the specifics with regards to the next several days in the east, the stalled frontal boundary is going to mean for possibly some showers and storms. It doesn't really do a whole lot during the day on Wednesday, but we do have that risk area indicated by SPC from southeastern Virginia southward and southwestward from there. The GFS does produce some strong storms tomorrow in parts of South Carolina and Georgia and back over to southeastern Louisiana. That boundary just kind of sits there. Here in the northeast, just on the muggy side, not really overly warm, maybe because of cloud cover limiting any kind of heating. I think you could see the odd pop-up shower or storm. And then Saturday and Sunday will probably be able to warm things up. That frontal boundary is a little bit further to the east, so that maybe will give us a little more room to allow for some sunshine. But other than the odd pop-up shower or storm for the northern mid-Atlantic on up into southern New England, I don't really see any big problems here through Sunday. And then your next cold front, which is here Monday afternoon, you can just barely pick out some showers and storms on the GFS coming through. Perhaps it'll be a little bit more robust than that, but again, it doesn't look to me like it's any kind of severe weather event. And then more of the same going through next week. I really don't see too much change. There's another front there on day 8 that approaches with a bit of a high that builds down. And of course, you see that the model does bring up some kind of tropical system out of the Gulf, out of the Caribbean, and moves it up. But again, not something we would pay attention to until we get inside the 5-day time frame. Now, with respect to the tropics, and I want to bring the upper air for the North Atlantic and see where this is going. You'll notice that we start out with the flattening of this east-west high from the Azores to the Bahamas, going through the next several days, and it just kind of stays like that. You've got a fairly strong west to east ruler-like flow from New England to Spain. Deep upper low there, northwest of England, between England and Iceland. That pulls out, but you still basically have this relatively narrow east-west ridge running across the South Atlantic and carrying us through the next 10 days. It doesn't really change very much. You can see the action in the east with that upper trough and the upper low that drops down into southeastern Canada and between New Brunswick and Newfoundland by the time we get to day 9 and 10. And of course, you still have that ridge off to the south. Now look, one of these, it's got to wake up eventually. You've got no El Nino working, so maybe again there's some kind of a lag in terms of the atmosphere trying to play catch up to a more favorable pattern. I still believe that we're going to probably just wake up one day and there's going to be a bunch of storms running around, or the potential for a bunch of storms running around. It's just not going to be tomorrow or the next day. You look at the loop There's actually still some Saharan dust in play. You can see that sort of brownish shading there out in the Atlantic, north of the bright white clouds that are at the intertropical convergence zone. We've got a few weak tropical waves there. There's still a little bit of Saharan dust out there, and also off near the Canary Islands. You don't have anything going on of consequence in the Caribbean. You still have some strong wind shear happening there. You've got clouds and showers extending from the northeast Gulf across Florida and out into the Atlantic for several hundred miles. There's not much you're going to get out of that. So you're still in a very quiet setup here with the tropics, at least for the next 4 or 5 days. Now, after that, we'll see if the GFS is onto something. I don't believe the European showed anything like that today. We'll give it a look and see if it did. I don't believe it did, but let's try and I didn't even look at the Canadian, because you know how the Canadian loves to spin things up. We'll just look at the surface here to see if it. I'm pretty sure it didn't do anything, and in fact it didn't. No, it's got nothing. Then as far as, let's look at the icon model, because that's always fun. But that only goes out to 120 hours, so it doesn't go out far enough. See if the prior run takes us out a bit further. You don't have really much there. Lower pressures down, way down in the south, in the southern part of the Caribbean Sea, but nothing to really write home about. The Canadian out to 240 has nothing. Okay, in fact, just for laughs, because you know how I love to say how the Canadian model in the hurricane season loves to spin everything that moves, and even out in the tropical Atlantic, I mean, it really does nothing. So when the models that usually spin up everything that moves can't spin up anything, you know that there is an issue here. So I guess the best thing to do from that standpoint, in terms of whether something's going to come out of the tropics, just like with the approach with severe weather, I think it might be a good idea to just wait till something really starts to get going before you jump on any bandwagon with regards to whatever one model is doing versus another. Rainfall, by the way, over the next 7 days, and of course this is going to reflect the frontal boundary that is setting up right along the Carolina coast. And the inland rains are on the order of 1 to maybe 2 inches over the next 7 days. The big rains are going to happen along and east of the frontal boundary, which is, if it's right along the immediate coast, you can see some of the big rains that are being produced from the Gulf of Mexico, by the way, right across into northern Florida. You're seeing that large orange area. That's a 5-inch area being indicated there. And then you got that heavy rain offshore. Heavy rains in parts of Iowa, northwest Missouri, northeastern Nebraska, southeastern Nebraska, northeastern Kansas, on the order of 3, 4, 5 inches or more. Hardly anything from the Rockies west. And in the east, up and down the east coast, again, this will probably be convectively driven, because we don't really have too much happening over the next 5 or 6 days. So rainfall amounts on the order of 3/4 of an inch to 1.5 inches, maybe a few spots seeing some locally higher amounts. So that kind of sums up what's going on tonight. Thanks for coming on board. We had that one burst yesterday. Everybody seemed to be really interested in in all the severe weather. I guess because it was played up so much early in the day, and you don't get me until late in the evening. Javon Perry, double hits on Super Chat tonight. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. And yes, I know the rumors are out there with regards to the snowy winter. When the pre-chat here on this live stream, because I usually put up the time of the live stream about 2 hours before I do it, and so a number of you jump on board. Of course, the chairman, Scott Briller, usually is the first one on, and we have Chuck Cardillo, and Chris Alley might jump on early, and Johnny Quest, and a few others. And Johnny, of course, waiting to go over his 110-inch mark for rainfall. the conversation today kind of shifted over to snow, and I'm just, it's August 13th, so let's give it a little bit of time, and let's get hurricane season under our belts before we start getting into what may or may not be the winter coming up. Scott Briller, yeah, well, the parallel GFS, by the way, it's the FBV3 now, the main GFS, we should see snowstorms spinning up next month. Well, as bad as that parallel GFS was when they first released it before they pulled it, supposedly they corrected the cold biases. That'll be interesting to see when we get there. George Senda, 100 degrees Fahrenheit tomorrow in San Francisco East Bay. It was 94 yesterday. You had to walk in it about a mile, maybe 104 in Pittsburgh, California, where my girlfriend lives. It can get, under the right conditions, of course, when you get that east wind up in Northern California. And by the way, I think you're new, so welcome to my YouTube channel. Thank you for being here. You can get very hot, but at the very least, it is most of the time. I know you're going to say, the old line of a dry heat, but it does matter. Okay, it does matter. Just want to take a look at your dew points, which is always fun. I mean, nice dew points in the 40s and low 50s. That's down in the long range. Let me go to the short range here. But we're looking at dew points. Yeah, I mean, even down right along the coast, you got dew points in the 40s. What's better than that? And the 2 meter temperatures, and this is kind of hard with regards to how the GFS treats it. But yeah, you have the models actually showing some really big numbers in terms of heat in the interior, 110 or better in a few spots. But it even has the 90s very close to San Francisco, right along the coast. So it would not a shocker there that you are as hot as you are. Just running back over to the chat, Javon Perry. Now that El Nino is 100% gone, I hear the tropics of the Atlantic may be busier. Yes, NOAA did up the doubled up. They went from slightly above normal, so they're calling for a total of 17 named storms. We've had 2, which means 15 more. If that's the case, it's going to be a very busy next 2 months, from mid-August to mid-October. You're going to put 15 storms. Now, granted, probably the vast majority of them are not going to be land threats, but nonetheless, that's a very busy period we're looking at. Every day that goes by that we don't have a tropical storm, if you're going to hit those numbers, you're going to have to do it with a stretch somewhere in there where you've got several storms running around at the same time. It happens it doesn't happen every year, but most years you do have at least one stretch where you've got 2 or 3 named storms running around. Now that El Nino is 100% gone, heard the tropics may be busier and longer than normal. Also, the ocean water temperature is getting significantly warmer, increase of hurricanes in a snowy winter. I do not know of any correlation between the hurricane season and the upcoming winter. Remember that snowfalls are very much locally driven, so you got to look at these individual events in the wintertime and where's your wind coming from, how cold is your air, inland track versus coastal track as far as lows are concerned. The one kind of broad correlation that a friend of mine mentioned to me is the fact that a back-end loaded hurricane season that starts late and ends late, but particularly one that ends late, where you've got tropical storms still running around in November, the latter part of the month of November in particular, usually seem to come with winters that are back-end loaded rather than front-end loaded. So you might want to bear that in mind going forward. So this is usually where listen. Being a snow lover, I understand it. You try to grasp at every straw that you can. And I get that. I totally understand it because I've done the same thing and I still very quietly will do the same thing. But understand that it's very hard to make correlations, and there are other factors that I think are far more important than whether the hurricane season, gives you a tie-in to what kind of winter you're going to have. Go back and look at the records. There are winters where you have actually had El Niños going or La Niñas going of varying strengths. So there's a lot of other players in here. You've got I think the Pacific Jet, the state of the Pacific Jet, is probably one of the more important players and the one that you want to look at first. Because if that jet is a screaming fire hose from Japan to California, you can put the winter to bed for a while. We could have a stretch like we had last year with a lot of inland tracks and lows that went west of the Appalachians. So just bear that in mind. I think that's really where you want to look first. And you're certainly not going to find that out now because we're only into August. Joe Gaffney, nice to see you on board, Joe. Before the close last night's show, one model showed the risk further south and almost nothing in New York. I believe you could have used either the HRRR model, if I remember correctly, and I think also the NAM 3 was further south. My memory's kind of vague with regards to the globals. I think the GFS was sort of on par with the NAM 12, having it further to the north. Okay, so Scott, I wasn't paying attention. So if one of the maps had blue showing snow in Canada, I know way up there it has been doing it because up there certainly we're getting to that point now where it's going to start showing up. Mirtha Gunter, I know you mentioned how dry it was where you are in your part of North Carolina, so maybe you'll get some scattered showers and storms with this frontal boundary lying very, very close by. Let's see, what do we got here? Just running back. Timothy Veltman hearing raindrops on the roof. There were some big storms going through in upstate New York earlier this evening. Just want to take a look on the radar. That line in upstate New York it's a very narrow east-west line. It looks like it's running just north of I-86 and 17 and then goes northeastward. It's south of it looks like it's mostly south of I-90 and pushing further south, but it's a fairly narrow east-west line. Don't see anything severe in that. There were some bigger cells in there earlier, but it looks like they may have gone past their peak intensity. Okay, so we're going to go to the bottom of the chat here. Stephen Franco, make sure we stay away from that fire hose. If we get a back-end loaded hurricane season, that will help to amplify the jet stream for some cold air. Maybe not. We'll see. That's really going to be that's certainly short range dependent, and we're talking way down the road. Let's see what hurricane season, when it revs up in the next few weeks, where it takes us. Steve Lapointe, are we done with 90s for New York City and Long Island? I don't know. I mean, look, if the pattern stays the way it is, you could still it's still early enough where you could have the odd 90-degree day. But unless you get a big ridge to build up, it's going to be hard to imagine how you're going to push it up to back to mid and upper 90s. Maybe the extreme heat, of course, now that I've said that, maybe the 2 days of extreme heat we had back in July were really it, and maybe we could be done with it. Looking at that upper air, if that winds up verifying, it's hard for me to see how it's going to get much above 90. You might get the hot spots getting to 90. Long Island, by the way, especially certainly for Suffolk County, once you get past the middle part of August, 90-degree highs are pretty relatively rare. You got to have an almost perfect setup with a west or a west-northwest wind, and that would be an instance where places to the west are going into the mid and upper 90s. I certainly don't see that happening any time in the next week or so. And now you're pushing past August 20th. The 90-degree days start to whittle away. So fingers crossed that they're over with. I really I've kind of had enough of it. My tolerance for heat as I've gotten older has gotten lower and lower. So I really look forward to the fall and just get the fall weather, the nice cool nights and the reasonably nice days and the deep blue skies, kind of like what we had this past weekend. Okay, I think that wraps it up for tonight. So thanks for being here. As always, we have fun, and that's a good thing. Shelly Man Studios jumping on board late tonight, but it's always nice to see you here. And Ms. Sphalerite. Very, very nice to see you on board again tonight. You're relatively new, and I always welcome everybody that gets on the chat board. Love the conversation and love the questions. We'll see what happens in the next few weeks with regards to hurricane season. All right, so we'll leave it here. Again, next 3 days, maybe longer than that, maybe right through the weekend, looks reasonably calm for my neck of the woods. So be sure, if you haven't already, download the free weather app. If you do have the free weather app and you've got you have an Android device, make sure it's updating, because the app itself has been updated so that you don't have to go to your manually put in your location. It's supposed to it should automatically default to your location when you go to the local forecast page. So if it's not doing that, then you need to update it. And if it doesn't work, then I would suggest you delete the app and re-download it and reinstall it, and then it should work. For those of you who have iPhones, that update's just waiting for Apple. So I just hope that I wake up tomorrow and say, oh, the iPhone, the app has been updated on the iPhone, and then you'll get your update as well. So hopefully any day now. I lose, dealing with these tech companies is really, it's an interesting experience. Technology has only created new bureaucracies that you have to cut through. And they just basically have a formulated way of doing things in terms of when you want to get something done, and you just have to go through the steps. It's their, they kind of control it's their ballpark, and you're playing baseball in their ballpark, so you got to sort of play by their rules. Google's usually pretty good about updating things fairly quickly. Apple's, they take their time, and they have a different set of criteria. So when it gets done, it gets done. All right, so everybody have a great evening. Thanks again for being here. Regular live stream tomorrow, probably around 7 o'clock Eastern time, and we'll see you then. Good night, everybody.